The Gospels never name him. History barely remembers him. Yet the soldier who drove the spear into the side of the crucified Jesus stands at the center of one of the most mysterious and quietly devastating transformations in all of biblical history. He was a man of iron discipline, trained to feel nothing, shaped by an empire that valued efficiency over mercy and rewarded obedience over conscience. He had built his life on following orders without question, on being the last and most reliable instrument of Roman authority in a world that ran on fear. And yet, in the span of a single Friday afternoon on a rocky hill outside Jerusalem, something happened to him that no amount of military training could have prepared him for, and no amount of imperial loyalty could explain away. What dark fate awaited the man who helped end the life of the Son of God? And what became of him in the long years after that hill fell silent and the crowd went home? To find the answer, we must return to a Friday afternoon in Jerusalem, almost 2,000 years ago. The city was crowded beyond its usual capacity. Passover had drawn Jewish pilgrims from every corner of the known world, from Egypt and Babylon, from Rome, and from the scattered communities of the diaspora stretching across the Mediterranean. The streets were thick with people and thick with tension. The Roman administration, always uneasy during the great Jewish festivals when religious fervor ran highest and the memory of past oppression burned freshest, had ordered a visible and unmistakable show of force. Soldiers were everywhere. The message was clear. Rome was watching. Rome was in control, and Rome would not hesitate to act. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, had already made one of the most consequential decisions in human history. He had taken a man from Nazareth, a man his own investigation had failed to convict of any crime deserving death, and condemned him to crucifixion anyway. The political pressure had been too great, the crowd too loud, the risk of disorder too real. Pilate had washed his hands of it, literally and symbolically, and handed the prisoner over to his soldiers. The order was given. The machinery of Roman execution, refined by centuries of practice into something almost bureaucratic in its efficiency, moved forward without hesitation. The man the Romans called Jesus of Nazareth had been condemned to die on a cross, the empire's most brutal and deliberately public form of execution. Crucifixion was not designed merely to kill. Any number of methods could accomplish that. It was designed to degrade, to humiliate, to extend the dying across hours so that every passerby could see it and understand what it meant to challenge the authority of Rome. The condemned man was stripped, exposed, displayed on a road or hillside where the maximum number of people would witness his suffering and draw the appropriate conclusions. 4 gospel writers describe the scene in careful detail, and each one notes the presence of Roman soldiers carrying out the orders they had been given, with the practiced calm of men doing a job they had done many times before. The soldiers had already beaten Jesus beyond recognition earlier that morning. They had laid into him with a flagellum, a whip embedded with bone and metal, until the flesh of his back was laid open. They had mocked him with a crown of thorns pressed deep into his scalp until the blood ran freely down his face. They had draped him in a purple robe and placed a reed in his hand as a false scepter, kneeling before him in theatrical contempt, and then striking him across the face. Then they had stripped the robe away, reopening every wound the cloth had begun to close, and forced him to carry the heavy crossbeam through the winding, crowded streets of Jerusalem while the city watched. By the time he reached Golgotha, the place of the skull, Jesus had already endured hours of suffering that would have killed a lesser man long before the nails were ever driven in. At Golgotha, they nailed him between 2 criminals, one on his right and one on his left, completing the image of degradation by placing him in company with the lowest of the condemned. Then, the soldiers settled in to guard the execution, making sure no one interfered, that no sympathizer cut the ropes or pulled the nails in a desperate act of rescue. They cast lots for his seamless robe, a garment so finely made, woven in a single piece from top to bottom, that even these hardened men could not bring themselves to tear it. They offered him sour wine on a sponge when he cried out with thirst, a small act that some scholars interpret as a rare and almost involuntary flash of human feeling in an otherwise mechanically dehumanizing ritual. And then they waited for death to finish its slow and terrible work, as they had waited at so many crosses before. The biblical text presents these soldiers as professionals doing their grim duty. Nothing more, nothing less. Men who had been shaped by years of military discipline into instruments of state power, men who had seen death many times over and learned to look at it without flinching, without questioning, without feeling anything that might slow down the work. But something extraordinary happened as the hours dragged on that Friday afternoon, something that no Roman military manual had ever described and no veteran soldier had prepared them for. The sky turned black at midday. Not a gradual dimming, not the slow approach of a storm cloud on the horizon, but a sudden and total darkness that fell across the whole land without warning, as though the sun itself had looked away from what was happening beneath it and refused to watch. For 3 hours, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, the darkness held. The soldiers standing guard at the foot of the cross could not have explained it. There was no eclipse that day in the astronomical records. There was no natural cause that fits what the texts describe. There was only the darkness, and the man dying in it, and the sounds of his breathing growing slower and more labored as the hours passed. Then the ground moved. An earthquake rolled through Jerusalem with enough force to crack stone, to split rocks open, to send people stumbling in the darkness and reaching for something solid to hold. And at the very moment Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last, the enormous curtain that hung in the Jerusalem temple, the veil that separated the outer courts from the Holy of Holies, the innermost and most sacred chamber where God himself was understood to dwell, tore from top to bottom. Not from the bottom up, as a human hand gripping the fabric might tear it. From top to bottom, as though something immeasurably larger than any human being had reached down from above and split it in two. The barrier between God and humanity had been removed, and the whole city trembled. In the midst of all of this, one soldier looked up at the dying man and spoke. The words are recorded in Matthew and Mark with quiet precision. Truly, this was the Son of God. The Gospel of Luke records a slightly different but equally remarkable declaration. Certainly this man was innocent. This was a centurion speaking, a battle-hardened Roman officer who commanded 100 soldiers, a man who had risen through the ranks of one of the most powerful military organizations in human history through demonstrated courage, discipline, and competence. He had watched men die on crosses before. He understood death in ways that most people never would. None of it, not one death in all his years of service, had looked or felt or sounded like this. And so he spoke, not privately, not in a whisper to a fellow soldier, but publicly, in front of his men, in front of the watching crowd, in front of whatever record the universe keeps of the words human beings say in moments of extremity. Whatever he had expected from this particular execution detail, it had not been this. The Bible does not stop there. The Gospel of John adds a final and deeply significant detail that brings the centurion back into the story one more time. Because the Sabbath was approaching at sunset, and Jewish law was very clear that bodies could not remain on the cross overnight. Particularly during Passover, the religious authorities asked Pilate to authorize the breaking of the condemned men's legs. Breaking the legs was a kind of merciful efficiency. Without the ability to push themselves up to breathe, the crucified men would suffocate within minutes rather than hours. The soldiers went to the two criminals first. Both were still alive. They broke their legs. But when they came to Jesus, they found he was already dead. He had been dead for some time, one soldier, wanting to be absolutely and officially certain before he put his name to a death report that would travel up the chain of command all the way to Pilate, thrust a spear into the dead man's side. Immediately, blood and water flowed out. The author of the Gospel notes this detail with the precision of someone who understood its medical significance. Because the separation of blood and water, what physicians would later understand as the separation of red blood cells from the serum of the pericardial sac, was definitive proof that the heart had already stopped. The man on the cross was beyond any possibility of recovery. He was dead. The soldier had confirmed it. The report could be filed. The execution was complete. The Gospel does not name this soldier, but over the centuries that followed, Christian tradition gave him a name that would echo across 2,000 years of history, a name preserved in ancient martyrologies and church calendars and the memories of communities scattered across the ancient world: Longinus. According to these traditions, carefully preserved and passed down through the early church, the centurion who had stood at the foot of the cross and declared Jesus to be the Son of God, and the soldier who had driven the spear into his side, were one and the same man, a soldier who had been present at both the declaration and the desecration. A man who had looked at Jesus and named him Lord, and who had also been the last instrument of his official death. To understand the full weight of this tradition, we need to understand who a centurion actually was within the Roman world, and what it meant for such a man to be changed. These officers occupied a position of immense respect and crushing responsibility within the most powerful military in the ancient world. They were the true backbone of the Roman legions, not the distant generals whose names filled the history books and whose faces appeared on coins, but the men in the mud and the blood who actually held the line when battle turned chaotic. A centurion trained his soldiers, led them into combat from the front, disciplined them when they failed, and buried them when they fell. He earned his rank through years of demonstrated courage and competence, rising from the lowest ranks through sheer ability in a system that promoted ruthlessly on merit. His vine staff, the gnarled wooden rod that was the physical symbol of his authority and that he was entirely permitted to use on the backs of soldiers who disobeyed him, was real power in a world built entirely on hierarchy and force. Stationed in Judea, officers like Longinus found themselves managing one of the most volatile and religiously charged corners of the entire empire. The Jewish population was deeply, fiercely, sometimes violently committed to a religious identity that made straightforward Roman assimilation essentially impossible. Unlike most conquered peoples, who eventually adopted Roman gods alongside their own and melted more or less gracefully into the imperial culture, the Jews maintained an absolute monotheism that could not accommodate the Roman religious and political order. Their God was not one God among many. He was the only God. Caesar was not divine. The Roman gods were not real. This was not a negotiable position, and it generated constant friction, periodic revolts, and the perpetual threat of larger rebellion. Crucifixion was Rome's primary tool for managing this threat publicly, visibly, and unmistakably. It was a language that everyone understood. And yet this particular centurion, standing at the center of exactly the kind of execution Rome used to communicate its power and its permanence, found himself unable to speak that language anymore after what he had witnessed. He had stood at the foot of the cross and watched the sky go dark and the earth shake, and heard a dying man commend his spirit to his Father. And something had broken open inside him that all his training had never prepared him to handle. The confession he spoke was not the product of quiet reflection. It was wrenched out of him by something he could not name and could not resist. A man who spent his career maintaining control in the most extreme circumstances imaginable had lost control of his own tongue. He had said what he saw. And what he saw had changed him. What became of him after that day? The biblical record closes with his words and says nothing more. But early Christian tradition, drawing on accounts that circulated within communities scattered across the ancient world, fills in the story with details that vary in their specifics but agree in their essential shape. The soldier we call Longinus did not walk away from Golgotha unchanged and go back to his normal life. He could not. The accounts describe a man profoundly and permanently altered by what he had witnessed, and by what he had done. Some traditions add a physical dimension to his transformation. They describe Longinus as having suffered from seriously deteriorating eyesight for some time before the crucifixion, a condition that years of military service in dusty, sun-scorched provinces had worsened until his vision was badly compromised. According to these accounts, when the blood and water poured from the side of Jesus as he drove in the spear, and a few drops fell on or touched his eyes, his sight was restored instantly and completely. He who had been going blind could suddenly see with perfect clarity. And in that moment of physical healing, according to the tradition, came a simultaneous and equally sudden clarity of a different kind: recognition. He had not simply killed a man, he had pierced the side of God. What followed, the traditions tell us, was a complete reorientation of his life. Longinus left the Roman military, an act that, depending on the circumstances and how it was categorized by his superiors, could be treated as desertion, a capital offense in Roman military law. To walk away from the legion without authorization was to forfeit every protection Rome offered: rank, pay, legal status, pension, the network of relationships and obligations that structured a soldier's entire social world. It was to become, in a very real sense, a man without a country. And yet he did it. He made his way to the apostles, to the circle of men and women who had gathered around Jesus and who were now, in the weeks and months following the resurrection, beginning the work of carrying his message outward into a world that had not yet heard it. Longinus told them what he had seen. He became one of them. The traditions differ on the details of his movements in the years that followed. Some place him in Cappadocia, a region in what is now central Turkey, an area with ancient connections to early Christianity and a landscape of caves and rock-cut dwellings that offered both shelter and secrecy to communities trying to practice a faith that the empire had not yet decided how to classify. There, according to these accounts, he lived quietly and worked and prayed and told whoever would listen the story of what he had seen on a hill in Jerusalem on a Friday afternoon when the sky went dark. He was not a theologian. He had no formal training in religious argument or doctrinal debate. He was a soldier who had been present at the most important moment in human history and could not stop talking about it. Others say he traveled more widely before settling, moving through the network of early Christian communities that were already beginning to form in the cities of the Mediterranean world, leaving his testimony wherever he went. What the various strands of tradition agree on is that his faith, however it had come to him, cost him everything he had once valued. The Roman authorities eventually caught up with him. He was brought before officials who offered him the standard choice: recant, return to the fold, and live, or maintain his confession and face the consequences. The man who had once enforced Roman authority with a spear now stood on the receiving end of that authority and refused to move. He would not renounce the name of the man he had killed. He had seen too much. He knew too much. No threat carried enough weight to undo what he had witnessed with his own eyes on the hill called Golgotha. The accounts of his martyrdom vary in their details, as ancient accounts almost always do when genuine history is being transmitted across centuries by communities working from memory and oral tradition. Some say he was beheaded, a soldier's death, swift and final, on a hill somewhere in the provinces, far from the ceremonies and crowds that attended official executions in the capital. Others preserve far older and stranger accounts, including a 6th century tradition that described a punishment almost mythological in its imagery: a cave, a lion, a cycle of nightly destruction and morning healing that never ended, a kind of eternal reckoning for the act of piercing the Son of God. Whether this tradition reflects a genuine early account or the medieval imagination working overtime on a figure it could not quite categorize, it speaks to the seriousness with which the early church took his story. This was not a minor figure. This was a man whose act had been woven into the center of the most important event in Christian theology, and his fate carried enormous symbolic weight. Later, and more widely accepted traditions honor him simply and without complication as a martyr, a man who died willingly for his faith, who faced the violence of the empire he had once served with the same calm that Jesus had shown on the cross. and who refused to the end to say that what he had seen was not what he had seen. The Catholic Church observes his feast day on March 15th. The Eastern Orthodox tradition honors him on October 16th. In Rome itself, in the great Basilica of St. Peter, one of the 4 massive pillars that support the central dome over the high altar is dedicated to him. Beneath that pillar stands a colossal marble statue. A Roman soldier in full armor, his spear in his hand, his face tilted upward, his expression carrying something that the sculptor clearly intended as recognition, as the look of a man who has just understood something so large that it has reorganized everything else. Millions of pilgrims and tourists have walked past that statue over the centuries without knowing his name. But the statue stands there in the heart of the largest church in Christendom, a permanent and monumental witness to the tradition that the man who pierced the side of Jesus was the first soldier, and perhaps the first person outside the circle of disciples to declare him Lord. The question of historical certainty is one that scholars have always and rightly pressed. The name Longinus does not appear anywhere in the New Testament. The earliest documents that name him in connection with the crucifixion come from several centuries after the events they describe, and they carry all the hallmarks of hagiography, the genre of sacred biography that mixed remembered history with theological reflection and legendary embellishment, in proportions that cannot always be separated cleanly. Some scholars have pointed out that the name Longinus appears to be derived from the Greek word for spear, longe, which raises the possibility that the figure began not as a remembered individual, but as a personification, the spear-bearer, who became, over time, a person with a name and a story. And a feast day. Others argue that the geographical spread and internal consistency of the tradition across wildly different communities and centuries argues for a real historical core that the legends grew around, as legends almost always do. The debate is ongoing, as honest scholarship requires it to be, but here is what neither side of that debate can take away. Whether Longinus was a specific historical individual or the crystallization of a tradition around the figure of the centurion who spoke at the cross, the story he represents is true in the deepest sense. It is true that the Gospels record a Roman centurion standing at the foot of the cross and declaring Jesus to be the Son of God. It is true that a soldier drove a spear into his side. It is true that the early church, in its collective memory and its collective imagination, could not stop returning to these figures as witnesses of a particular and irreplaceable kind. People who had been present not as believers, not as followers, not as people who had any reason to hope for anything from this dying man, but as the instruments of his death. And it is true that the tradition insists, with remarkable consistency across enormous spans of time and distance, that at least one of those instruments was broken open and remade by what he had done. The man known as Saint Longinus stands, in the Christian tradition, as a kind of limit case for grace. He represents the outermost boundary of who can be reached and changed and turned around. If the soldier who drove the spear can become a saint, then the category of people beyond redemption is empty. That is what his story is for. That is why the church kept it and honored it and built a statue to it in the center of its most important building. Not because every detail of his biography can be verified by modern historical methods, but because the truth it carries is larger than biography. The story of Longinus invites us to reflect honestly, without the soft cushion of sentiment and without the false comfort of easy resolution. The crucifixion was not a symbol or a spiritual metaphor available for private interpretation. It was a real event, in a real place, on a real afternoon, in the first century of the Common Era. The suffering was real, the nails were real. The soldiers were real human beings with real histories and real choices, not cartoon villains placed in the story to give the hero someone to suffer against. They were people shaped by a system that valued obedience over conscience and rewarded the ability to perform violence without hesitation. They did what they were trained to do, what they were ordered to do, what the whole structure of the world they lived in told them was simply their job. And yet, in the middle of all of that, in the darkening afternoon on a skull-shaped hill outside the walls of Jerusalem, something divine broke through the ordinary surface of human history. Grace found a centurion who had not asked for it, had not earned it, and had arguably done more to disqualify himself from it in the past several hours than most people manage in a lifetime. That same grace, the tradition insists, did not stop with Longinus. It has been finding people in unlikely places ever since. People who were simply doing what they were trained to do. People who had long since stopped expecting anything from God. People who had drawn a line around themselves and decided that whatever mercy might be available in the universe, it had no particular reason to find them. And then something happens. Not always an earthquake. Not always a darkness at noon. Sometimes something far quieter, a question that won't leave. A moment of recognition in an unexpected place. A crack in the armor that has taken years to build. And the person who was simply doing their duty finds themselves standing at the edge of something they cannot explain and cannot stop thinking about. We may never know every detail of what happened to the soldier after Golgotha. We may never resolve, to everyone's satisfaction, exactly where the history ends and the legend begins in his story. The Bible wisely leaves his name unspoken in the sacred text, perhaps because the namelessness is itself a kind of gift. When there is no name, the story belongs to everyone. It belongs to every person who has ever stood at the edge of faith feeling irreversibly unqualified, every person who has done things they cannot undo and wondered whether mercy could possibly stretch that far. The answer the tradition gives is the same answer it has always given. No one is beyond the reach of the cross. Not the soldiers who drove the nails. Not the centurion who watched Jesus die. Not the man who drove the spear into be certain. And not any of us who find ourselves, in whatever way and in whatever circumstances, standing at the foot of that same hill today, in the dark, searching for something solid enough to hold. The soldier of Golgotha began that Friday as an instrument of empire, a professional in the business of state violence, a man whose identity was built entirely on his usefulness to Rome. He ended it as a witness to something the empire could not contain or control or crucify. In the centuries that followed, that witness cost him everything the empire had given him, and ultimately cost him his life. He paid the price without flinching and without recanting. That is a transformation worth remembering. That is a story worth telling, and it is still, 2,000 years later, being told in feast day observances, in marble statues, in YouTube videos, and in the quiet moments when ordinary people in ordinary circumstances find themselves, unexpectedly and without quite knowing how, standing in the place where the centurion once stood, looking up at the cross and trying to find the words for what they see. If this story stirred something in you, take a moment right now to like the video and subscribe to Biblical Worlds. Every week, we bring these ancient accounts to life with careful research and cinematic narration, going beyond the familiar surface of these stories to find the human beings inside them, and the truths that have never stopped speaking across the centuries. Drop a comment below and tell us what surprises you most about the soldier at the cross.
Truly divine.
Have you ever felt like an unlikely witness to something greater than yourself? We read every comment, and we genuinely love hearing how these ancient stories connect with real lives in the present. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next Biblical World.